The house in the Hollywood Hills was alive with music and laughter, but Marvin Gaye stood alone on the balcony, staring into the darkness beyond the city lights. It was October 1975, and he should have been celebrating. Let's Get It On had dominated the charts for months, selling millions of copies and cementing his reputation as one of the smoothest voices in soul music. Radio stations couldn't get enough of his sensual crooning, and women screamed his name at concerts from Detroit to Los Angeles. Yet inside, something was eating away at him like acid on metal. The party behind him pulsed with the artificial energy that powered Hollywood's music scene. Record executives in expensive suits discussed quarterly profits while snorting cocaine in bathroom stalls. Aspiring artists circulated like hungry sharks, desperate for any connection that might launch their careers. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, expensive perfume, and the kind of desperation that masqueraded as confidence in this city of broken dreams. Marvin had come to this party alone, driving his Rolls-Royce up the winding canyon roads while Diana Ross crooned from the radio. He'd told his wife Anna he was meeting with Motown executives, but the truth was he couldn't stand another night in their Beverly Hills mansion, surrounded by luxury that felt like a prison. The gold records on his walls mocked him. The Grammy nominations felt hollow. Success had become a weight pressing down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He didn't hear the footsteps approaching until a voice spoke behind him, cutting through the distant sound of laughter and clinking glasses. "You look like a man carrying the weight of the world." Marvin turned to see Sly Stone, the wild genius behind Everyday People, and danced to the music. But this wasn't the flamboyant performer the world knew, the man who had electrified Woodstock with his rainbow coalition of musicians. This Sly looked tired, his famous afro unkempt, his eyes holding the same emptiness that Marvin recognized in his own mirror every morning. "Maybe I am," Marvin replied quietly, his voice barely audible above the distant party noise. Sly stepped closer to the balcony railing, close enough that Marvin could smell the mixture of expensive cologne and something else, something chemical and sharp. "Mind if I join you in whatever this is? Solitude? Self-pity? Existential crisis?" Despite himself, Marvin almost smiled. "Take your pick." What neither man knew was that this moment would change everything. That a simple conversation on a balcony overlooking the glittering lies of Los Angeles would become the first step toward their mutual destruction. Two of the most innovative minds in popular music were about to find each other at exactly the wrong time in their lives. The party belonged to some record executive whose name didn't matter to either of them. What mattered was that both Marvin and Sly had come alone, both seeking something they couldn't name. The room inside pulsed with industry people making deals, trading gossip, and consuming substances that promised to make the emptiness go away, at least temporarily. Young women in short dresses attached themselves to older men with checkbooks. Musicians who had sold millions of records stood in corners, looking lost and desperate for relevance in an industry that devoured its children. Sly sat down beside Marvin on the outdoor furniture, his movement careful and deliberate, as if he was concentrating on something as simple as maintaining balance. For several minutes, neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two men who recognized something familiar in each other's exhaustion, something that went beyond the typical music industry burnout. The view from the balcony was spectacular. Los Angeles spread out below them like a circuit board, thousands of lights twinkling in patterns that suggested order but delivered only chaos. Somewhere down there, fans were playing their records, dancing to their music, making love to their songs. But up here in this moment, both men felt completely disconnected from the joy their art had brought to the world. "They want me to make another thank you album," Sly finally said, referring to his massive hit that had dominated radio in 1969. "Same sound, same energy, same everything. They don't understand that I'm not that person anymore. That guy who believed music could change the world? He's dead. I killed him myself." Marvin nodded slowly, understanding more than Sly probably realized. He understood completely. Motown's Berry Gordy had been pressuring him for months to create another "What's Going On?" Another socially conscious masterpiece that could capture the zeitgeist and sell millions of copies. But creating that album had drained something from him that he couldn't get back. It had been like opening a vein and bleeding his soul onto magnetic tape. The music industry, Marvin said, watching a helicopter's red lights blink across the night sky. It takes pieces of you until there's nothing left but the shell they can sell to the public. Sly laughed, but there was no humor in it. The sound was bitter, hollow, like coins rattling in an empty cup. And then they wonder why we can't give them what they want anymore. They want the passion without the pain, the soul without the suffering. They want us to be vending machines that dispense hits on demand. As the night progressed and the party inside grew louder and more chaotic, the two men found themselves talking about things they rarely discussed with anyone. The conversation meandered through topics that would have seemed disconnected to an outside observer, but made perfect sense to them. They talked about the isolation of fame, the way success could become its own kind of prison, the pressure to constantly reinvent yourself while remaining exactly the same. Marvin spoke about his father, about the beatings that had left more than physical scars, about the constant voice in his head telling him he wasn't worthy of the success he'd achieved. He talked about growing up in a house where love was conditional and violence was guaranteed, where every day was a performance designed to avoid the next blow. My father used to tell me I was worthless, Marvin said, his voice so quiet that Sly had to lean closer to hear him. Used to beat me with whatever was handy and tell me it was for my own good. Said I'd never amount to anything, that I was a disappointment to God and to him. Some days I still hear his voice, telling me he was right all along. Sly talked about the pressure of being a black artist in a white-controlled industry, about how his revolutionary music was being sanitized and packaged for mass consumption. He described the frustration of watching his multiracial band being marketed as a novelty act when what he'd wanted was to break down barriers that had existed for centuries. They love the idea of integration, Sly said, his hands gesturing expressively in the dim light. They love the concept of racial harmony, but they want it on their terms, in their format, for their profit. They want the revolution without the rebellion, the message without the mess. You ever feel like you're disappearing? Sly asked at one point, his question hanging in the air like smoke. Marvin's response was barely a whisper. Every day, like I'm becoming less real with every record sold, every photo taken, every interview given, like they're stealing pieces of me and selling them back to me at a markup. They shared stories of recording sessions that felt like torture, of standing on stage in front of thousands while feeling completely alone in the universe. They talked about the women in their lives who couldn't understand why success felt like a prison, about the friends who had drifted away as fame isolated them from everything authentic and real. We're the lucky ones, they tell us, Sly said, gesturing toward the party inside where cocaine was being passed around like party favors. We should be grateful for what we have, thankful for the opportunity to share our gift with the world. But grateful for what? Marvin replied, his voice gaining intensity for the first time that night. For losing ourselves? For becoming products instead of people? For having our pain packaged and sold to the highest bidder? Around 2 a.m., when the party had thinned out and the conversation inside had devolved into the incoherent rambling that marked the late stages of pharmaceutical enhancement, someone emerged from the house and approached their quiet corner. It was a woman neither of them recognized, blonde and artificially enhanced, the kind of person who seemed to exist solely to facilitate connections between people, with too much money and too little sense. She carried with her something that would change both their lives forever. A small vial of white powder, presented as casually as someone might offer a mint or a piece of gum. You boys look like you could use something to take the edge off, she said, her voice carrying the kind of practiced seduction that worked on desperate men. This will make all your troubles disappear, at least for a while. Marvin had never touched cocaine before. His addictions were subtler but no less destructive. Work, perfectionism, the endless pursuit of a sound that could heal his broken spirit or at least distract him from its pain. But that night, sitting with someone who seemed to understand the specific nature of his suffering, the temptation felt different. It felt like a solution rather than a problem. Sly looked at the vial, then at Marvin, his expression unreadable in the dim light. I've been dancing around this edge for months, he admitted, standing right on the precipice, looking down into the abyss, wondering what it would feel like to just let go completely. "What's it like?" Marvin asked, his curiosity genuine and terrifying. "Like silence," Sly replied, his voice dreamy and distant. "Like all the voices in your head finally shutting up. Like being wrapped in cotton, insulated from all the sharp edges that keep cutting you. Like being able to breathe underwater." The decision wasn't dramatic. There was no moment of conscious choice, no internal debate about consequences and alternatives. It happened gradually, like stepping into water that's deeper than you expected, like walking into fog that grows thicker with each step. One moment they were two men talking about their pain, and the next they were two men sharing a method of escape that would define the remainder of their lives. The substance hit them differently than they expected. Instead of euphoria, they found a kind of artificial clarity, a chemical confidence that made all their problems seem manageable. The weight that had been pressing down on Marvin's chest lifted, replaced by a sense of possibility that felt almost like hope. Sly's constant anxiety, the racing thoughts that had kept him awake for months, quieted to a manageable whisper. "This is what normal people must feel like," Marvin said at one point, marveling at the absence of the psychological noise that usually filled his head. "This is what we could have felt like all along," Sly replied, "if we hadn't been carrying around all this extra weight." What happened in the months that followed became the stuff of industry whispers and tabloid speculation. Marvin, who had always been disciplined about his work despite his personal struggles, began missing recording sessions. His legendary perfectionism devolved into endless, unproductive hours in the studio, chasing sounds that existed only in his altered consciousness. Sly, already known for his erratic behavior, became completely unpredictable. He would show up to recording sessions days late, disappear for weeks at a time, and emerge looking like he'd been wandering in the wilderness. His famous Family Stone band began to fragment as members grew tired of accommodating his increasingly bizarre demands and unexplained absences. The two men developed a routine of late-night phone calls, long, rambling conversations that made perfect sense to them, but would have sounded like madness to anyone else listening. They created a private language of shared paranoia, convincing each other that their phones were tapped, that government agents were monitoring their activities, that the music industry was part of a larger conspiracy to control and manipulate black artists. "They don't want us thinking too clearly," Sly would say during these midnight conversations, his voice distorted by whatever substances he'd consumed that day. "They need us doped up and compliant," Marvin would agree, pacing around his bedroom while Anna slept in the next room, oblivious to her husband's descent into a world she couldn't understand or access. The irony was completely lost on both of them that they were destroying themselves far more effectively than any external enemy could have managed. They had become willing participants in their own destruction, enthusiastic consumers of their own demise. By 1977, the transformation was complete and irreversible. Marvin, once meticulous about his appearance and professional image, looked gaunt and hollow-eyed. His famous smooth complexion had taken on a grayish pallor, and his hands shook constantly from the combination of stimulants and the anxiety that crashed over him whenever the drugs wore off. Sly had become a literal ghost of his former self, showing up to recording sessions in sunglasses that hid eyes red with exhaustion and chemical burn, speaking in whispers when he spoke at all, leaving sessions without explanation and returning days later as if nothing had happened. The industry that had once courted them now whispered about their unreliability, their erratic behavior, their descent into something darker and more troubling than simple excess. Record executives who had once competed for their attention now avoided their calls. Session musicians talked among themselves about the sad spectacle of two former geniuses destroying themselves in slow motion. The phone calls between them grew more frequent and more desperate as their shared reality became increasingly disconnected from the world everyone else inhabited. They were drowning together, two geniuses who had found in each other not salvation, but a companion for their destruction. Each conversation reinforced their shared delusions, their growing belief that the world was conspiring against them in ways that only they could perceive and understand. In the end, that meeting on a Hollywood Hills balcony in October 1975 had been exactly what both men were looking for, and exactly what they should have avoided. They had found someone who understood their pain so completely that together they had transformed it from a bearable private suffering into something that consumed them entirely. Years later, those who witnessed that night would remember it as the moment two of music's brightest lights began to dim permanently. The moment when understanding became enabling, when recognition became mutual destruction, when two broken souls found each other and broke even more completely. Neither man ever recovered from what they discovered in each other that autumn night when the Los Angeles air was thick with possibility and danger. They had sought connection and found destruction. They had reached for understanding and grasped annihilation. And they had done it together, hand in hand, step by step, into the darkness that would define the rest of their abbreviated lives. Today, if you drive up those same winding canyon roads in the Hollywood Hills, past the gates of houses where parties once promised everything and delivered nothing, you might pause at the spot where two voices that moved millions chose silence over sound. The house where Marvin and Sly first recognized their shared emptiness has changed hands multiple times, its walls unable to hold the weight of what happened there that October night. Music historians debate the timeline, the details, the exact substances involved, but they miss the essential truth. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can find is someone who understands your pain completely. Two men who had spent their lives feeling isolated discovered they weren't alone in their suffering, and that discovery became their undoing. In the archives of both men's unfinished work, there are traces of that meeting. Fragments of songs that sound like conversations, melodies that seem to answer each other across the void. Evidence of a connection that was both the best and worst thing that ever happened to either of them. The party ended. The night ended. But the consequences echoed until their final breaths.